Well, g'day everyone. It's the Two Ordinary Cops, and we are back. Damo, mate, how are you?
Good, mate. How are you?
Yeah, mate. Yeah, cruising along, mate. We've got a bit of exciting news in this episode. We've got somebody coming on. I'll let you do the introduction, but before we go on, I just want to do a shout out to Paul because I think I forgot last time. He listened to our episodes, and he's basically lived around the Northern Territory quite a lot. He even mentioned he listened to Bob Rennie's one about Jabaluka Mine, and he was actually out there as a miner when all that kicked off. So I'll go through his stories a bit more in detail later on. However, mate, I think we need to pass over onto the guest we've got on today. So, do you want to do the introduction?
I can indeed, mate. Yeah. So, look, we're very lucky today. We do like to get people involved, and especially people from outside the police force who come from very similar services and experience very similar things. So today we have a gentleman on with us who 20 years all up with the Queensland Ambulance Service and still serving. Finished up full-time active in December 2022 after a major incident that caused a lot of trauma, and that's what we're actually talking about today. But yeah, Queensland Ambulance Service Paramedic Peter Vinnicombe. How are you, Peter?
Yeah, I'm good, guys. Nice to meet you.
You too. So Pete, the reason we obviously you and Schultzy have been chatting back and forth, but you appeared on SBS Insight recently, and obviously we can what you said on that episode really resonates with us. So to recap what you sort of did, do you want to just run through and give us a brief outline of what you sort of your background and what has occurred throughout your career and what brings you to be on the episode today?
Yeah, mate. No worries. So, I became a paramedic in 2005, a student paramedic. Where I started when it was the old school going through the service education. So it was the diploma. Obviously now it's a bachelor degree and all done through university. So I started at Brisbane at Roma Street, so one of the CBD stations, which was a really cool place to be a student. It was a fairly young cohort, but obviously stupidly busy, but great exposure to all sorts of different types of things, medical, trauma, drugs, the works. And, that might sound a bit macabre, but when you're a student paramedic, you've got to learn as much as you can, and the only way you can learn is by seeing and doing. You can learn so much in a textbook, and then you've got to put it into action. So it's a 3-year student course, and yeah, I don't know how many times I would have given Narcan when I was working at Roma Street. So Narcan is what we used to give for the heroin overdoses. Oh, heaps, just heaps, and haven't given it since I left in 2008. So it's all changed there. And then from there, I became the officer in charge at Barcaldine Station. I went out there and completely unseen, went to the sticks. Dragged the wife and 2 kids there, sight unseen, and it was a terrifying thing for them. They're all city slickers, so it was a big culture shock. But we were there for 18 months or so and absolutely loved it. Really good small community, single officer, which I'd never really done before. So you're on call. You generally, in most single officer stations, you work an 8 on, 6 off roster, and you're on call for 24 hours a day, pretty much while you're working. And then from there went to Hewenden, and then came over to Garoo. And so Garoo's a small little sugar town about 60k south of Townsville. Again, a single officer. So I've worked single officer since 2008. So what's that? 17 years, best part of 17 years. And so, which has its challenges. And the good thing about working in somewhere like Garoo is that you are fairly close to a major metropolitan centre. 60 k's from Townsville was quite good, so that backup was around. But whereas Hewenden and that, you're a couple of hours from anyone. So yeah, they're very different experiences. And then, unfortunately, in 2022, I was going good. I was one of the what I'd call the lucky ones, where I wasn't having any sort of mental health. I'd seen psychologists because there was obviously some jobs that were a little bit, not great. And I encourage everyone in every service to see a psychologist regularly. And then, I got attacked by a drug-affected human being in. And very early in the morning, single officer, and I honestly thought I was going to die. It was truly life threatening and the scariest experience of my life. And I worked and um, took him to hospital and worked the rest of my swing. And I was struggling to get to sleep. I was, obviously seeing his face, trying to go to sleep and things like that. And then when I saw the psychologist, did some EMDR, which, if people haven't had it, it's an amazing trauma therapy that can essentially help you deal with the emotional side of a trauma. So I did that, and it was quite good, and I thought I was okay. And then I worked for a couple more, I think one or two more swings, and I just realised I wasn't okay. I was getting really short and cranky with patients, and I'm someone who I pride myself with my patients into patients. So we often get called to what we kind of think are ridiculous jobs, and they can be annoying, but again, I pride myself on being patient and explaining or or treating or whatever. And I remember I went to 3 jobs in a row that I almost lost my shit. I said some words to patients that I shouldn't have, and I self-identified that I'm not okay. So I remember I rang my bell. I was on the way back from a job, and so my final day working a shift. Okay, so going to get into some gory details, but my first patient was a deceased person who had 6 chihuahuas who hadn't been fed for a few days. So you can
Oh
imagine.
dear.
Yeah.
Yep. So that was pleasant. Plus, it was outside, and in the elements, and that wasn't very nice. Uh, and then these chihuahuas were actually really friendly towards me, which when you see them eating a human body, you're kind of a little bit nervous when they run up to you, the old small dog syndrome. But
Yep.
so that I did that. I went to a man who the previous day, it was DV related, so it was actually mental health, because the previous day he had beaten up his pregnant wife, and they'd served a DVO on her, and then now he was suicidal. And again, I normally can put all my personal feelings aside. No, I couldn't. So words were exchanged that I wasn't comfortable with me feeling that way. And then the last one was just a silly job. It was just a person who thought by stroking her cat she might have gotten venomated by a snake that the cat had caught earlier, and venom might have been on her fur. And it was an ignorance thing, but it's their emergency, so I try not to judge that it's their what our version of an emergency and their version of an emergency can be very different. And but I lost my shit. I'm like, this is ridiculous. So, that was when I knew I wasn't okay. And then, I came back, and over the next sort of couple of months, I just went on a downhill spiral. Really depressed, really withdrawn. Uh, Friends would message me or ring me or invite me to go fishing and things like that, and I'd make up every excuse under the sun, and I just entered a dark hole. I was never suicidal, but I was on who knows where the path ends when you're on that downward spiral. So, and eventually it was the wife that rang up a psychiatric clinic. We're lucky enough to have a private facility up here, and to get into a psychiatrist was a 6-month wait. Which is really hard when you're undergoing a crisis. But she rang up and she managed to get that fast tracked, and I ended up going into the clinic for a couple of weeks, and best thing I've ever done for myself. I can say it saved my life. It was a circuit breaker where when you finish work, you lose who you are. You feel guilty. You feel ashamed because why am I broken? There's 4,000 other paramedics in Queensland alone. A lot of them aren't broken. Why am I? Why was I okay and now I'm not? And then you're angry because of the circumstance that put you in there. That I was attacked. You've got that moral injury side of things as well. And then what it did was it opened Pandora's box. So all these jobs that I thought were buried, filed way back in the filing cabinet of the brain, they started bubbling up to the surface. And I'd be driving around and I'm just getting flashbacks, all these geographical flashbacks, all these, you'd watch a movie or the news or whatever, and everything would trigger up these images in your head that you didn't even remember that you remembered. It was just they were so long ago. Some of them, some jobs were 15, 18 years ago, and you could smell them. You'd be there and you would smell them. And I really struggled with just a real feeling of guilt. I knew, I denied that I had PTSD for a long time until I went into this clinic and we did an inpatient trauma course. And then the first day of that course was, going through some of the common signs and symptoms of PTSD. And it was like tick, 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 tick. Shit, yeah, okay, yeah, I do have this. And I love the way you guys framed it in one of your previous episodes of the the variety, the spinal cord injury versus the fractured ankle or twisted ankle, and that's it. PTSD is not linear. You can be having a good day one day and you could be pretty normal, and you'll have other days where you can't get out of bed, and the thought of doing anything is just overwhelmingly, no, can't do it. Sleep was impossible. I was sleeping 2 hours a night for 6 months. That was really, really hard. And if you don't get sleep, you're not getting better. Your brain needs to get better. So that was one of the priorities, was getting my sleep fixed up, and it needed medical help, medication help, and there was a lot of tweaking and stuff like that for that. But once you start to get your sleep under control, then you can kind of concentrate on other things that make you get better. It can be a really slow process.
Yeah. Well, Pete, that's you've given us a lot there, sort of going right back through your career, and especially talking about the unfolding of it all, how it just took that one incident where that was the unraveling, and then everything came out. I think during the Insight program you mentioned the filing cabinet was opened, and once the filing cabinet was open, you couldn't put the files back. So can you just I think the idea is, I think the goal of what we want to learn is we want to try and present this to people who are listening to the podcast, because Schultzy and I both, we don't have PTSD like that. I actually did a test. It'd be about 6 weeks ago. I was just at the GP and he suggested that I do as a former first responder, just have a go, just do this test. He came out basically saying I've got slightly above average anxiety and don't have PTSD, but for not a paramedic, for a first responder, I've got sort of below average anxiety, and I don't know why that is. I think I didn't hit my trigger point, thank God. But can you just explain to people how it is to unravel like that? So that just that one thing can make you unravel. I know you explained it a bit there, but
yeah, it's really disconcerting, and especially when you get these intrusive thoughts that can come quite randomly, and the one thing I never realised was how many ambulances are on the road. I now get a physical reaction. I get goosebumps and get the shivers every time I see an ambulance. And when you're driving an ambulance, or or they're a non-event kind of thing, you just don't realise it. When you have a physical reaction to seeing an ambulance, holy shit, there's a lot of them on the road.
Yeah.
And we can be at places, and paramedics will turn up, and my wife will react before I do, because I will try and internalize it. I know I'm having a reaction, but I try and internalize it, and then she will go into protective kind of mum mode, and she will either try and get me to leave, or to distract, or whatever the case may be. So it's I'm kind of lucky compared to some other people, and some of the the extremes of PTSD that other people can get as well. So it's the one thing it's really hard to do is compare everyone's triggers, because everyone's different. Some people, they hallucinate, it can be awful. And doing the course, which I did that trauma course with other first responders. There was police officers and veterans, and everyone had a variation in how they in how they dealt with it. I think for me, I always sort of struggled with whether I fit into the PTSD diagnosis. And then I came across a term called moral injury. And that was something I hadn't heard of before. And I can't remember who suggested it to me, but they said, have a look at this. And I went to, I think it's called the Moral Injury Project.com. Yeah, either .com or .com.au. And it's actually written by an Australian professor. And it was like a holy shit moment. That is me. And moral injury is not just about the trauma. It's not necessarily one event. It's about the organizational trauma, and the feeling of vulnerability you get when things don't go 100% the way you want them to do, as far as your organization is concerned. One of the things I talk about on that Insight episode was the Armour. And I think all first responders and veterans, military people, we all, our uniforms are our armour as well, because they give us a respect that we feel and that other people feel. Some may have a different opinion when it comes to police uniforms, but but I knew when I put on my uniform, I was proud to put it on, and I was proud with what came with it. It came with 100% trust from anyone who called. It came with responsibility. It came with people opening their houses up for us to go in their darkest times, and we work very closely with police and fire. In smaller place, we do just as much with both, and all of us use that uniform as our way in, but it also gives us, I call it our armor, because the barbs and the names and the insults and the things that might affect you from day-to-day life. If you're at the schoolyard, you'd probably get crushed by some of the things that are said to you. But the armor that we wear by our uniforms just kind of brushes that off. It very rarely hits. Very rarely. It's you're at work. It's just, you don't take it that personally. But unfortunately, when that armor gets a chink in it, and that can be from that your organization didn't react quite the way you wanted to, or that you felt let down, or whatever the case may be. It varies from people to people. And moral injury isn't something that just affects first responders. It can affect you could work for Telstra, and it's just as likely to have an effect. So I found that once those sort of chinks appear in your armor, the things hurt that you didn't realize hurt. And I think that's where it kind of opens up that filing cabinet of jobs that were deep and dark right in the back of the recess of your brain. They just get brought back to the surface.
Peter, one thing you mentioned. Sorry, Schultzy, I've just got one question. Sorry, one thing you said, and obviously going back through your history, you said since 2008 you basically worked as a single station officer, so worked by yourself. Now you mentioned that your uniform was your armour. Well, us too. Our uniform or our plain clothes that we would wear as a uniform were our armour. But another piece of our armour was our team. How did you find not being part of a team and not being able to share that experience? How did that? Do you think that added to it?
100%. I remember one of the first. I don't know if you'd call it lucky, but I went a long time before I had a patient physically die on me, as in they were living when I got there and they died before I dropped them off. I'd had plenty that had gone into cardiac arrest, before I'd got there or after I'd handed them over or whatever the case may be. And I remember, so I went, I think 9 years without having somebody actually arrest in front of me. And then I had 2 in 2 days. And I remember going back to the station and you just question, what did I do wrong? Everything that and we're all our own worst critics in these sort of situations. We all question what could we have done, and the problem is that when you've got somebody there, when you're driving back to the station or you're driving wherever, you go for a coffee, you just have this informal debrief. You crack dark jokes, you do some very inappropriate jokes that public would be horrified if they heard a lot of our stuff, but it
Join
is
that
part of
team.
our but it's our coping mechanism, and it's that informal chat, and I do think that there is a lot to be said for it's not just the clinical aspect of it, but the psychological aspect of being a long-term single officer. I think there needs to be a lot more study on it. And I know it's a bit of a controversial thing. And because we're such a spread out state, I can't imagine they're going to put the cost of putting 2 officers on it at a time would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's what it comes down to. It's a money thing. But yeah, I think it has a cost.
Yeah. Schultzy, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, mate. There was a couple of things like you talk about the uniform, and like Damo mentioned, even if we're in plain clothes. And one thing I've heard a lot of cops say, it's very hard to give up the badge. So, like our badge was basically our armor. When you wore that, the power that was invested in you to do the right thing and all that sort of stuff. It's a massive responsibility, but it's very, very hard to give up. And I resonated with that. Also, the other thing you said that like the armor when you get that break in the armor, I felt that I think that was part of the reason that started the spiral in me leaving. One of my own officers put a complaint in against me, and that was something that I've always been approachable, and I thought that was a bit harsh. But the other thing was, we always spent a long time doing jobs, and so if one of our other friends in the police or colleagues had a job, we would jump into it and get it done. We would pass it on when we were working, like Damo and I were working investigations. If out bush they needed help with an investigation, we would do it. And I had a couple of very big ones, and I was probably unfortunate because I've been trained as a detective and I was out bush working. So they would give me a lot of high level cases, but when you work in general duties, you don't have the time. And I remember I tried to actually hand a couple of these over to investigators, because they had the time and the resources to do it, whereas I didn't. And they basically just sent it back to me, said, no, we're not taking it. And that, I felt really let down. Where was my backup? I always backed up my fellow officers, but I didn't have any backup. So, like that's similar to what you were saying, I imagine, in some aspects.
Yeah, medically it's different when you're in a rural station. Really, if you go to a big job out in the sticks, it's bloody terrifying going to them, because there is no let's say, for example, you're in Hewenden. So Hewenden, for those that don't know, is about 4 hours west of Townsville. It's about a 4 hour drive, 4.5 hour drive, and your closest backup would be Charters Towers, which is about a 2.5 hour drive. And I remember I got sent to a 10-person rollover at Prairie, which is 50 k's out of Hewenden. And it was one of the scariest half an hour drives I've ever been. And basically the way it works with those sort of jobs out there, you pick up often a firefighter. A lot of those places have auxiliary firefighters that are paid for being on call, and then so you'll pick one of them up, and they'll basically become your driver. And we we were on the way out to this job, and we're going through. We've got our triage kits. Do you guys carry triage kits?
No. Look. The police, generally speaking, there'd be a first aid kit in the vehicles. I worked in City Safe in Darwin City. We had a little bit more of an advanced trauma kit, and we had oxygen as well for drug affected or alcohol affected people. But we relied a lot on paramedics or remote area nurses.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So we're on the way, and basically a triage kit is something we use when we get there, and the colours are essentially black, which is no good, red, which is critical, yellow, which is not walking wounded, but not dying, and green, which is what generally a walking wounded, and that could be a broken arm, which still hurts, but they're not going to die from it, and they can actually walk themselves away from a scene. So I'm going through with the fiery on how to do that, and we rock up to this scene, and there's a minibus full of 15, 16-year-old kids that have rolled over, and yeah, there's a few relative injuries, but no one critical. But there's also 2 off-duty paramedics and 2 nurses there.
Wow.
And you're like, with 350 k's from from a major city, there's off-duty nurses and paramedics everywhere.
Yeah.
And they'd done all the triage, they'd done everything. I got there and it kind of messed with me because I'm like, oh, I was about to do this and now that's all done. So yeah, there was off-duty paramedics everywhere, and we don't have powers. We don't get sworn in as paramedics. We're now under ARPRA, so we're registered paramedics, but our ability to carry drugs and administer drugs comes from our employment, not from our title. So if I'm always hyper vigilant when I go out, and if somebody goes down in front of me, then I can't not do something, even though I know it's going to have a cost to me later on. Now, it didn't used to. I went to the Jimmy Carr concert, the comedian. I went to his show up here a couple of years ago, about 18 months ago, I think it was. And unfortunately, somebody in the crowd had a cardiac arrest just before the show, and ended up doing CPR. There was a few people going over there, and I went over, and security said, "No, you can't. We're good. There's people there." And then so I went back and sat down, and the wife was telling me not to go, and I'm like, oh. And then I saw them doing CPR, and like, well, I've got to go. I've got to help. So I went over there, and I just basically barged my way past to security, and there was a couple of people there, and they were like. I said, "Oh, hey guys, can I give you a hand?" And they said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I said, "I'm a paramedic." He's like, "Oh, thank fuck for that. I'm a copper. You take over."
Yeah.
And so basically, yeah, ran the job until paramedics arrived, and then ran the job with them. And then, look, if he was anywhere else, we wouldn't have transported. But being in a public setting like that he was transported. And then I spoke to his daughter and basically told her, that the outcome's not looking great. And then I had to go and sit down and try and do a comedy show, and that was
bloody hell.
Yeah, it was one of those things that adrenaline kicks in, and then I would have felt worse not going and not helping. I've got no legal obligation or legal powers to do it, but yeah, I couldn't not do it.
No, I think that's something that resonates with well, certainly with first responders worth their salt, but I even think just good humans. Unfortunately, we live in a world where people whip their phone out and film things. Well, I know that's certainly not the way that we generally think. It's generally jump in and do your thing. I'm actually surprised you didn't do the paramedic thing and say, no, you're doing excellent compressions. You keep that shit up. That's what we used to get.
Yeah.
Well, I guarantee you, I didn't do compressions on him.
No. Yeah, no, I always laughed at that. It was pretty rare for the paramedic, but that's fair enough. I mean, normally the paramedics had the drugs out and all the rest of it, and it was like, if we can get a few people pushing on the chest, that's always handy. But yeah.
Absolutely, and that's why we always made sure fireys, mainly fireys, because police are often too busy, especially in metropolitan. Well, pretty much anywhere. I don't think there's any such thing as a quiet police officer anymore. But the fireys used to come, and yeah, they were great because they would the biggest issue we'd have early on was getting them to rotate CPR because they'd just want to keep going forever. And you'd be like, no, you've done 2 minutes, next person, because there's so many studies out there that it doesn't matter how strong you are, you can't do effective CPR for longer than 2 minutes.
No, that little technical side point I've seen. I don't. You'd explain it better than I can, but obviously the equipment, the monitoring equipment that you guys put on, actually show the compression effectiveness. And I remember we had some really good. Some of my best friends are paramedics, and we had some really good paramedics. But when the job was on, all manners went out the window, and fair enough. They'd just go, "No, that was shit. No, you're out. Get off." So, and
absolutely. I remember the first time I ever did CPR I think it was my first week. My first week as a paramedic, I will never forget. I had to pick a baby out of a toilet that was stillborn into a toilet. It was about 32 weeks. And I did CPR, and I remember the first time I did CPR and I broke their bones. You break ribs. If you're doing effective CPR, you will break ribs because the job of the ribs is to stop the heart being hurt, and you're trying to squeeze the heart. So effective CPR, you're gonna break some ribs. And I remember doing it, and then naturally you go a bit lighter, and the critical care paramedic there was like no deeper, and and it was a real learning experience. There's nothing. CPR is an easy skill, but bloody hell, it's a violent skill. And it's a really horrible thing to watch. I've never seen it done on a loved one, and if I never did, that would be, I'd be too happy with that. It's a horrible thing to watch.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, mate. I don't know if you heard my results. I'm 23-0 when it comes to CPR, and I completely agree. I think the only thing that kept me sane with that carry on was the fact that I never did actually know the person. I might have known them in a community, but I didn't know them well, or didn't. They weren't a friend or a family member. And I often wonder how I would go, whether I'd go into work mode and just get it done, or whether I'd panic. I don't know. Which relates back to what you said.
And we can train, and you can hypothesize, but no one will know how they react when it's a loved one until it happens. In saying that, I've had my wife pass out and stuff like that. She used to have what's called a lot of vasovagals, where she would pass out because her blood pressure was quite low. So she'd. And I remember it happened that often that my kids would come in, and I remember. I think my eldest daughter was about 5, and she came in and she said, "Daddy, Mummy's on the floor again." No panic, just so nonchalant. So the more you train at something, the more automated it does become. And I know I have been accused of being a paramedic instead of a partner, or a paramedic instead of stop treating me as a patient. But sometimes you can't turn that off.
No, definitely not.
Yep.
Actually, it's interesting. You sort of talk about adrenaline there. I know we'll get back to the PTSD side of things because that's really what I want to focus on with you. But I want to get your input into something. I will never do a PhD on it because I'm not the kind of guy. But I train firefighters now, and I think back to my experiences, and we talk about adrenaline being fight, flight, or freeze. Well, I've added another one that I like to mention to them, and that's because we're talking about you need to get memory slides in your brain about things you've been trained, because when the adrenaline hits, your IQ is going to drop, and you're going to fall back on what is known and understood. I like to add the word focus. So I've been in a couple of situations. I've mentioned them on the podcast. I drew a firearm on a guy coming at me with a knife, And there was no fight, there was no flight, there was no freeze. I remember my brain, I was very calculated in what I did, but what it was a very intense focus. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We're as as clinicians, we're very systematic. So every patient is systematic, and even as part of first aid, the very basics of first aid is your doctor's ABC,
Yeah,
and you do that to most patients. Well, you do that to every patient you see in the first 2 seconds of seeing them. If you go in, let's say we're going to, I don't know, Mabel, who's got chest pain, we'll rock up and within a second, you're making all these judgments and you're doing this systematic approach, and it it becomes such second nature. And to the average Joe Blow, they probably think you're missing the first 78 steps, but you're doing them in point one of a second of seeing the patient. They're breathing, they're talking. When you go to a multicas, everyone wants you to go to the person who's screaming, whereas
yeah,
our attention will generally go to the person who's quiet.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that are possibly, if they're screaming, they're breathing.
yeah,
And they may well be the crookest, but they're breathing. So we're going to go see if anyone else is not breathing first, and then we'll get around, and do that triage that we were talking about before. So we're very systematic, and a really good example of this that is not it's not my story, but there was a crew that went to a young person. I think she was 4 or 5, young girl being driven in from a property, and they did a halfway meet where they kind of, when you're out in the sticks, it's not uncommon for mum or dad to throw the kid in, or whoever's injured, in the back of a car, and then they'll drive towards you and you'll drive towards them, and it just, it can cut 30 minutes out of a trip. So they did this, and this girl was, by the time the paramedics got to her, she was completely unconscious, barely breathing, and very systematic. And they ended up finding a fentanyl patch under her underwear. Now,
wow,
that would be so easy to miss if you're not systematic.
yeah,
So, by going through every step, reassessing, exposing, we don't go to somebody with a twisted arm and take all their clothes off. But
no,
if they're unconscious, we're going to strip them down, because we need to discount everything, So that was and that's a job that happened a long time ago, but it always stuck with me on how important, because if they were too scared to drop that girl's undies, that girl would have died.
yeah,
Yeah.
And it was being systematic. So yeah, with your focus, I think that comes down to repetition. It comes down to training and repetition. And I think the more, yeah, it is. I've been to jobs where they've been absolutely full on, and then afterwards you are absolutely exhausted because your focus is so tight, and then you're like, how did I think of that? How did I do that? Half the shit's happening without you even thinking about it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just,
Yeah.
so familiar. I just understand exactly what you mean. Obviously, we're not a medical setting; it's a policing setting, but it's dealing with danger and the needs. I think obviously paramedics are focusing very, very strongly on a patient. We're quite often focusing very strongly on a very severe threat. It might be that there's an imminent threat, or it could be that we are at something where there is extreme trauma and we're first aiders. But I like to think we're fairly extreme first aiders because we're generally first on scene to something like that, and we don't have the gear, and we're sort of trying to do our best. I train first aid now, and one of my colleagues, the main first aid trainer that I work with, is a paramedic here in New South Wales, and she said to me early on, I said, "Oh, this would be really good. I learned, the first aid stuff. I don't have a lot of experience in medical stuff, but it'll be interesting." She goes, "This is first aid. You've got more experience than I do." She goes, "I turn up as a paramedic. You're a first aider."
I'm
And she sort of
hopeless at
mentioned,
bandaging and slings and all that sort of stuff. I'm
well,
absolutely
more
terrible
just
at it.
holding, more just holding stuff together and saying, "Don't get up, stay where you are, stop moving. The bloody ambulance will be here in a minute. For God's sake, do I have to handcuff you?" Or just
Yep.
full on CPR on a person who's more than likely already deceased. That was a lot of what we did. Obviously, we turn up to a lot of high
One of the
level
things that
trauma.
we did working with the police is that especially if we're going into like a pub or something like that, then we don't, when we know the police are there, we don't have to have eyes in the back of our head,
Yeah.
whereas we do when they're not. So by having police there just to be our eyes, it allows us to fully focus on the patient, because the amount of people that are getting hit or hit from bystanders rather than, I don't know the stats, but I would have to say that majority of the incidents of the assaults are not from the patients; they're from bystanders.
Yeah.
So having police there, it just allows us to focus. And working single officer, most of the time the police were single officer as well. Sometimes they were in two, but often they were single officer. And it wasn't uncommon for me, if we go to a job and it's a mental health or whatever, and the cop is getting hands on, well, I'm not going to stand there and watch, just cheer you on and hope you do well. You get involved and you help pin them down and get them restrained and things like that. So
Yeah.
while we've got no training for that as such, I think you've got a moral obligation to help. We're not going to go running into somebody with a gun, but if you guys are wrestling, then we're certainly going to give you a hand.
Oh, I've seen that on a number of occasions, especially in the mental health area where you're talking about there. If we were restraining someone, quite often a paramedic would come flying over, and all you'd hear was sharp, and then whack. You see the needle go in, and you go, "Oh, thank God, the dazzle is there." So, we were always really grateful. We worked really well. Actually, in Catherine, we've mentioned him previously. There was a very well-known paramedic who was a good friend of a lot of coppers. He went very hands-on with a number of offenders to protect police a few times.
Yeah.
And we thought he was the best thing since sliced bread. He was just such a good, practical fella. He just knew how to solve a problem. So, it's one of those things. First responders solve problems, and often problems that a lot of other people would not want to get involved in.
Absolutely, yeah. And I heard your episode the other day talking about the mental health, and mental health is something that our two agencies especially collaborate in a huge amount. In Queensland, where ambulance are the primary agency, and police are there for safety and security, and sometimes it can take hours. I would much rather talk to a patient for an hour than jab them with a needle and a sedative that can, there's risk to every medication. You do not know what the reaction is going to be. So if you don't have to put a medication in them, then if you can talk your way. And I've been on scene for hours with a patient where they're right on the precipice, and you're just trying to stop them going nuts, violent and things like that. And you'd rather spend an hour or two than them do something that they could end up regretting for the rest of their life. It's funny because with the powers that we have under the Ambulance Act, I think I heard you mention it on a previous episode that sometimes it's our act that enables you guys to go hands on. So, and I've had it in the past where I've had a fairly inexperienced constable who's refused to handcuff a patient, and saying he's got no grounds. I'm saying I'm directing you to do it under the Ambulance Act, and under the Ambulance Act, you are allowed to do pretty much whatever you need to do for the safety of that, for the safety of that patient. And it ended up he actually ended up ringing one of the district duty officers, and they were basically, do what you're told.
God, And I think. I think that comes from the fear factor from policing. Obviously, we're not going to go into talking about police disciplinary processes, but I think there is a lot of fear in the police force, especially amongst junior people who haven't got a lot of experience, because you come out of the college being told the million and one ways that you can lose your job and end up in prison by doing your job. So there is a lot of fear there, and I don't agree with that training. It should be that you need to understand you need to be responsible for what you do, but at the end of the day, you do have these powers. We are expecting you to act. And that I would imagine that's where that comes from, that fear of only knowing that, and that lack of experience, really.
Yeah, well,
Absolutely, absolutely.
before we move on there, like, yeah, Damo, you're exactly right. I found towards the end, a lot of the time we were going to incidents and we were actually directing young connies because they were too afraid to actually go hands on and all that sort of stuff. And I think, Peter, it was me that mentioned there was one paramedic that said, if I give an order and they refuse, I need you to restrain them. So that was, I loved working with paramedics who were just like that because, well, I knew where the powers were, but yeah, Damo, you're dead right. A lot of young connies don't actually understand that.
No.
But
Pete,
the
if you don't
Ambulance Act
mind,
is the Ambulance Act is such a strong act. It's essentially you can do whatever you need to do for the benefit of your patient as long as a reasonable person will do the same. That the old pub test.
Yeah,
So, and that if you got to knock a building down, you can knock a building down as long as it's
yeah,
a reasonable thing to do. Your powers are almost they're huge, but obviously with that comes a lot of accountability.
oh, of course, yep.
yeah,
And that's the thing. I think with experience comes the ability to go, yes, we did this, and the reason we did this is this, this, and this. And I think, and I remember thinking back as a young police officer, your cognitive load is really high because you've received all this training. You don't have a lot of memory slides as to how you actually do your job, and the eyes of fear see danger everywhere. So you'd be forever looking around, going, "No, I can't do that. I need to do this, or it doesn't quite meet that threshold." And yeah, it's the old analysis paralysis. Whereas you get a bit more experienced, and you go, "Well, this is what needs to be done right now. I know I'm sweet," and you do it, and you go, and you justify it at the time, or once the danger is gone, you can make notes and justify your thought processes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just experience, and I've seen it in firefighting and training firefighters these days. Oh, we need to do a sit rep. Forget the sit rep. You need to put that fire out. It's going to spread right now. You need to have it's going to hit all that fuel over there, and it's going to kick off. You need to just act, and we'll update them in a minute. So, it's sort of applicable to all of the emergency services.
Absolutely, and all experience is just building your database of potential scenarios. I remember when I was a student actually, so within my first couple of years, and we went to a person who was very very sick. They were basically unconscious on the ground. They'd been on that ground for about 4 days, and crush syndrome was an issue. So, for those that don't know, crush syndrome is basically where large muscle masses are starved with oxygen because of pressure, and your own body weight can do that. So, if you're in the same position for a long time, what essentially happens is that those muscle tissue, those muscle cells start to die, and they release toxins into your body, and they can cause almost instantaneous death once that pressure is released. And we had this gentleman, and he was really crook, where his abdomen had almost merged into the rug that he was on, and he was so sick we couldn't get a line in. We tried his feet, we tried everywhere, and this was before we had now critical care paramedics can go into the bones and things like
Yeah,
that, which they couldn't back then. And somebody came up with the idea of, so the biggest danger to this particular patient was that the moment you release the pressure his body is putting on, the moment you lift him up. So essentially what we did was lifted him up on the rug and put him into a body bag, and then lifted the body bag up and put him on the stretcher, and then took him to hospital.
wow,
So at no stage was his body weight not pressing down on these muscles, which meant they could do it extremely slowly at hospital. And and it was one of those things that I don't know where the hell that idea came from. It was somebody, one of the paramedics was there. I remember that job because it was the first time I'd ever seen a police officer wear a gas mask because
yeah,
it stunk so bad.
yeah.
wow.
He was lying in his own feces and all that sort of stuff. He was very sick, but he survived because of this person's thinking outside of the box to achieve what needed to be achieved. And that doesn't happen you can't learn that out of a book. You can't learn that in a year. That can take however long.
Yeah, that's that experience. I couldn't agree more. Look, Peter, there's a few things I want to go back and sort of finish off with the PTSD side of things. But if you're happy to talk about it, do you want to share any of the really funny things you dealt with?
Oh,
I
so
know I've put you on the spot here.
yeah, and that's the one thing during this whole process that therapeutically is, and I don't know if you guys feel the same. You very rarely think about the good or the easy jobs. You can go to a kid who's broken his leg, and you can be their savior in their eyes. You've given them all the meds, you make the pain go away, you've taken them to the hospital. In their eyes, you're it. But for you, that's kind of a normal job, so you don't think about those sort of ones. So you
No.
concentrate, and people only ever ask, "What's the worst job you've been to?"
Oh yeah, I hear
Yeah.
you.
And it's like, well, why do you want me to relive that? You just want the gory details, and you kind of you end up just concentrating on those negatives, and human beings have such a negative bias anyway. So it's really been a therapeutic process to actually go through and think about positive jobs
Yeah.
and funny jobs. One of the earliest jobs that I know a couple of friends still get a giggle off was, I remember we were called to a woman who had, in her mind, the one. I'll preface this from saying everyone's emergency is their own emergency. So if in their eyes this is a life-threatening or a serious event, that's fine. It is what it is. In retrospect, it's easy to have a laugh about it and stuff like that. So I don't want people to kind of not call an ambulance because they're worried they're going to get the piss taken out of them.
Yeah.
But it's so that's the preface for that. But this woman called because she thought she'd ingested a foreign substance, and when we got there, it turned out that she had a Panadol, a couple of Panadol, and she ate the foil covering at the back of the sachet.
Ah,
When you pop
yeah,
it out, and she thought she was going to die from that.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
remember saying to her, I eat more foil when I have a kebab.
yeah.
Don't worry about it. But I may have also told her that if she wants to be sure, she could check her output for the next couple of days and have a look.
I don't know.
Yeah.
You should go. The hydrochloric acid in the stomach would probably make short work of it. But anyway, so the one thing I'd like to say there too is that when we have a laugh, I don't think unless something was just ridiculous, but it's very rare that we have a laugh at a person, especially in tragedy. Quite often, it will be a funny circumstance or a funny situation. We certainly have taken the mickey out of people who was, just absolute grubs. But yeah, it's normally the humour comes from a circumstance or something that's occurred, or it might be taking the mickey in a fun team building way with other people. It's very rarely. It's not funny when it's bullying or anything like that. And did you find
and
that's the same with paramedics?
100%. And it's
Yeah,
also something that's developed. I remember we went to a debrief for a particularly bad, it was a murder, and it was a couple of people ended up dying from this particular scene. And we did a debrief, a big operational debrief a couple of days later. And there was a few of us, there was probably nine or 10 people involved, plus a psychologist was there, who worked closely with the QAS, and we were cracking dark humor before the official sort of debrief was started. And there was a young female paramedic who got up and walked out, and she was really upset. She was crying, and she was probably 2 months out of
yeah,
of
yeah,
finishing her student program. And it was at that moment, as a manager, that I realised that, oh shit, this is it's a developed coping mechanism, but it's not. We've really got to be careful who we say it, and you'd never say it amongst the general public. But you've also, that was the moment I realised that even new paramedics or new police, new veterans, it's a developed skill that happens over time.
yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely, couldn't agree. Couldn't agree more. Yeah. Look, if you don't mind, Chelsea, we might move on a little bit, Pete. Now, you mentioned during the Insight program, one thing you did say was that you have a love-hate relationship with the word resilient.
Yeah, resilient is I do, because resilience is such an individual thing, and I think it's used as a political weapon. It's often used, I think resilience as an organization is often pushed back onto the individual when the organization should be supporting more, and that comes down to that moral injury that I was talking about earlier. I think, politically, if a town's counted as resilient, they're often left alone to fight for themselves and forgotten about. I think it's a political weapon. But we don't know how resilient we are. And
No.
resilience is, we don't, if your worst experience in your life is stubbing your toe and breaking your toe, then that is the worst thing that's ever happened to you. Whereas you're brought up in a war torn thing whose family's been bombed, and people are missing limbs, and that's the worst thing that's ever happened to them. But for each individual, it's still their worst thing that's ever happened. So I think to say somebody is resilient it just means they've got past the worst thing that's happened to them, but that can vary so much on what that is.
That's actually brilliantly put. I completely
Yeah.
agree with it. I've often looked and judged. I remember turning up to a very, very minor car bingle, and there was a woman in the front seat, and she was just, I mean, when I say minor, I mean, there was barely any damage to the cars. Basically, a car had stopped at a stop sign and then hesitated, and the car behind had been looking the other way, and assumed that the one in front had gone, and then gone to take off and just bumped the back of the car, and there was slight damage. And this woman had called police. She wanted an ambulance. She wanted everyone else. We've turned up and gone, you guys exchange detail, and the old mate, the fellow who'd hit her from behind, has just gone, oh, mate, she's lost the plot. She's carrying on. And I had a conversation with her, and she wasn't mentally ill or anything like that. She'd just never been involved in anything like that. And it was, like you said, it was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. To us, it would have been the most minor job we went to all week, but that was just her experience. The ambos turned up. We very quickly got rid of the ambulance, because obviously ambos in the Northern Territory they're very, very rare because of how busy they are. So that was that sort of sums that up. Her reaction was rather extreme for what we thought of the job, but you make a good point. It might have been the worst thing that ever happened to her.
Mate, I just want to cut in there. I was speaking. Well, actually, I was dating a she was studying psychology, and the analogy was put forward is like going out into, you go and you step into the ocean and you get hit by a wave. The first time you've ever been hit by a wave, and it turns you over, and you end up, you don't know which way's up and all that sort of thing, and you panic and all this sort of stuff. But then you get out of it. But then next wave hits. It's not quite so bad. Then the next wave, and experience builds that resilience. So yeah, I suppose that's one of the things of what do they call it? When you don't wrap people in cotton wool, because they also need to experience stuff to move forward. So
Absolutely, yeah. You don't want to expose them deliberately to harm, but you
yeah,
can't be a helicopter parent. You cannot, by overprotecting your child or anyone that you love, you're actually doing them a disservice in the long term.
Yeah.
yeah,
Pete,
So yeah,
just one thing as well.
resilience is something that it's used, and people use it really badly, I think. And that the episode that I went on for Insight, it was quite interesting because there was people there whose there was a psychologist who had a life expectancy of 32. She was now 36 and decided to have a child. There was people that lost their houses in the fires. There was and then there was a mother whose daughter made them really tired, and they were struggling with the fatigue. And my old man said to me, he goes, I found it a bit odd that they were on that show. I said, but the problem is for her, that's the thing she's going through at the moment, and that's the hardship and the struggle that she's having. And for her, it's as real as anyone else's trauma or problems.
yeah,
Yeah, yep, very true.
yeah. It is.
It's Yeah, it's a hell of a thing, and you don't, like you say, you don't know your limit, and I think that can be scary too because obviously you sort of the old, if you put your foot straight in a bucket of hot water, you know it's really hot and you take it out, but if you hop in the bucket and it warms up slowly, you sort of don't realize how hot it is. You can cope with it, and I think that's probably not a bad analogy for it.
Absolutely. One of the things I've always said, I've got a podcast as well where I talk about high trauma occupations, and the advice that I try and give people is that it's going to be the loved ones that notice that you're struggling before you notice that you're struggling. They'll notice that you're withdrawing. They'll notice that you're not coming to the social engagements. They'll notice the little things, and they might put it down to a bit odd, but when you add it all up, it's one of those things that you don't want to look back in retrospect after someone's done something permanent. But it's often the loved ones or the spouses or the really close friends that will notice that people are really struggling, because like the analogy of the water heating up is it when it's happening to you, you often don't even know it's happening to you. I knew I was depressed, but I didn't know I was clinically depressed when it was happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. No, it's a hell of a thing that, and actually that leads me on to my next question. And you made the point during the insight, it was kind of the last point you made. You said when you were forced to medically stop being operational within Queensland Ambulance, you said the loss of identity was an enormous impact on you, and also that status was taken away. So what you said earlier was you're very proud to put that uniform on, and I can relate to that too. Now, my circumstance is different. I left voluntarily. It was just my time. We needed to move for different reasons, for family reasons. But um, I can completely understand what you mean by that loss of identity, because I was Damo the copper. People introduced this is Pete, this is Johnny, this is Simon, and this is Damo. He's a cop. The same thing happens to doctors, to nurses, to firefighters, all your first responders or soldiers. You get introduced, and then they name your occupation. It certainly becomes your persona and your identity, and you're very proud of that. All of a sudden, it's gone, and I know I had a little bit of a struggle. But do you want to just outline what your feelings were there?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a very introverted person, and leading a conversation with and what's when you say g'day Damo, I'm Peter. The next question, 90% of conversations, what do you do for a crust?
Yeah,
And then it
Yeah.
becomes and when you say a paramedic, it's an instant conversation starter. And now I am absolutely shit at small talk. Put me in the uniform and I'll talk to anyone about everything. But out of the uniform at home or in a social environment, if I don't know you, I'm the one sitting in the corner not really talking to anyone. I'll avoid it. And that was before my injury. So it became it was the status it gave me. It was the status I gave myself. I was an experienced paramedic, and it meant everything to me. And I didn't have much of a social life outside of the workforce. So, one of the things I've heard you guys say before is it's really important to have a social network outside of your workforce. And I could not agree with that anymore. Nowadays, when I started, I was 27 when I became a paramedic. Nowadays, most of them are coming out and they're doing their degree straight from uni, and they're coming out, often still on their P's, and they're 20, 21 years old when they're out in the wide old world. And the first, I remember my first week going, Jesus Christ, there's another side of life that you don't realize how well you're brought up and how privileged your upbringing was until you enter the other side and see how some of the other people in society live. And you're like, holy crap. And, I've lost my train of thought now.
Yeah.
Oh, you're talking about identity, how that you were
Yeah,
very
that's
proud
Oh,
about
yeah.
right.
your identity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And So I used it as a crutch to talk to people and create that flow. And I think it gave me status, which gave me confidence, and that gave me an ability to talk to people socially. Then when that was gone, it was I didn't have that anymore, and it was like, okay, and it got to the stage where people ask me what I do. And technically, even now, I'm on work cover right now. So I'm still employed. I'm still a paramedic. I'm still a registered paramedic. So technically, I can answer with the words, I'm a paramedic. And sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But then you've got to kind of say, do you want to go down the story of why you're not doing it anymore? And I think that just depends on the circumstances. Part of my therapy, part of my healing is I've become a one man just drumming away at I want legislation changed. I want, and we can finish off on that if you like. We can get
definitely.
into
Yeah.
that. But I've become a one man band just drumming a public message of changing the way first responders are treated. Most people don't know when first. The problem is we are employed by our states, whereas veterans, army, defence force, they're obviously federally employed. Obviously, there's Australian Federal Police and things like that, but the vast majority of first responders are employed by their states. And when we're hurt by our service, if you can't go back to work, essentially, it might be slightly different in various states and territories, but in Queensland, you go off work and straight away your pay drops to 85% of your normal weekly earnings. So you're injured and then you get a 15% pay cut. Then after 6 months, it drops to 75%. Now, it's quite a well-paid job. It's not uncommon to be paid 150 grand with overtime and extensions and stuff like that and all the allowances. So you can earn good money, but you're working a lot of hours to do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's not too many people that can take a $40,000 pay cut overnight and be comfortable with where they're at, because their lifestyle is, and their debt and everything is about, what they've budgeted for. Nobody budgets that they're going to get injured and going to get 25% of their wage taken away. Then when you hit 2 years, if you're still on work cover and they haven't finalised it, which is my case, by legislation, unless your indicative disability is over 20%, and 20% is a really high threshold to get to, you get put down onto the disability support pension. So my current income through the work cover is $570 a week.
Yeah, wow.
Which is really tough.
Yeah.
Now, I have private personal income protection, and without that, I'd be bankrupt.
Yeah.
But that shouldn't even be an issue. It shouldn't be, I shouldn't be penalised because my injury is taking a long time. And there's people that never recover. There's people that can be bedridden. If the thing that you break, and I understand why they try and make it a little bit tougher so that there's an impetus to go back to work. So you have a broken leg, you do you get your surgery if you need your surgery, you do your recovery, and there's an impetus to go back to work. Mental health injuries statistically take a bloody long time, and they have a very high failure rate, where we don't go back to work. And so on top of being injured, you then have the guilt and the shame of not being able to financially contribute to the household as much as you should. Now, there's people say, oh, you can go get another job. I'm nearly 50 years old. There's not too many jobs that you can go out and get a wage equivalent to what I was on. I was an officer in charge in a rural station. I was on a pretty good money. There's not I'm not qualified for anything else. I don't have a degree. I don't have, all these things. So you have that to battle with, as well as your recovery from this mental health trauma. So it all stirs the pot and muddies that water. So I'm there's 160,000 paid first responders in Australia right now. There's 60,000 paid Defence Force members, and they deservedly get looked after, and I don't want them to miss out on a single cent that they get. But I can argue, and I think most people will agree, that the average first responder will see much more trauma in a career, even if it's a short career, than the average Defence Force member. So we need to look after our people who are hurt in the service of their community. Police officers see some of the worst shit on earth, and I used to and ah between being a copper and being an ambo, and now that once I became an ambo, I'm glad I never went down the police, because I think we deal with like 80% idiots. You guys deal with a hell of a lot higher than that, and you've got a gun. So it's something that I've got mad respect for the police and the fireys. We work collaboratively with them. I've got good mates that are fireys as well. But the problem is that when we're hurt, and there's enough trauma that's going to affect everyone differently. As your analogy, that twisted ankle through to the broken spine, it'll vary to what effects it'll have, but it will affect everyone who does those jobs. We should be looking after those people, and I think the general public 100% support that. The problem is that because we're paid by the states, and it generally needs federal oversight. I firmly believe, we've got the Department of Veterans Affairs. We need a federal Department of First Responders, for something along those lines, because they need to take federal oversight to coordinate this, because there's thousands of us and we are getting hurt from doing our service to the community.
Yeah, Pete, I couldn't agree more there. That's completely on the money. So one thing you actually said during, I think it was an ABC report, I also saw that, you mentioned that it's very rare that if you do this job for any length of time, it's not necessarily going to injure everybody, but it's certainly going to affect everybody. And I think I can't think of a single, and obviously I was a police officer, so it's mostly coppers who I know. I can't think of a single one who hasn't been affected by their work in some regard. So I don't have PTSD. I don't have it. I went and got the test. I don't have it at all. However, I am a bit different. And Schultzy, you're a bit different. So, and one thing I noticed,
I'm cranky with the world, mate.
Yeah, it'd be probably 2 months ago. We caught up in Brisbane with a group of ex and one current serving Northern Territory copper that we'd known from years back, and no one wanted to go home. There were a few people who said they were going to come for a quick beer, and they ended up staying for 4 or 5 hours. No one wanted to break away, because all of us are now living outside the job, except and one, she's on extended leave, but she's going back. Even all of us were saying, these are my people. But even my brother turned up. He's at 6RAR, so he's an officer at 6RAR, and he even said, "Oh, I relate to you guys. I get this stuff." And he goes, "This is a good group. You can be very vulnerable in that group where you can't necessarily be like that elsewhere." So I think anyone who does a first responder job, be it police, fire, ambulance, frontline medical, doctors, nurses, anything like that, you're going to, our corrections officers, they poor buggers, they always get forgotten, but they deal with all this shit too. You are definitely going to be affected by it. It's going to have an impact on your personality, if nothing else.
Absolutely, yeah. Corrections officers are, like you said, are often forgotten about, but they're all first responders rolled into one role, dealing with the worst of society. I do a support group where I help run a non-profit called Team Code Blue, and we help first responders in Queensland and New South Wales who have been hurt by their service, because there's such little support out there, and unfortunately we can't afford to support corrections because we are a small non-profit, but there's hundreds of them, and I know a number of them who have got PTSD, and severe PTSD. It is life changing, because At least, as I said earlier, being a paramedic, we are welcomed into people's houses. We are given trust. We are given privilege. We are given respect. Well, a corrections officer is the exact opposite.
Hmm.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah,
No,
I
I
can
couldn't
I
agree
think
with
they've
you.
got the toughest job on earth.
Yeah, I've got well, one of my mates, or Chris, he was corrections for a while, and he used to. So when I was a cop, he used to talk to me, and oh, you guys just deal with the worst shit. And I said, actually, mate, no, you deal with the people, the worst of the worst that we put away. I said, we still help the little old lady getting across the street, or getting a car parked and all that sort of thing. So we see a little bit more, better than what corrections do. Poor corrections officers, they just get lumped with the worst shit that we deal with.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've
It's a
got
real job.
a massive amount of respect for corrections officers.
Well, Pete, look, I'm just so happy we got you on. This has been really good, and it's been excellent to get such an in-depth report, basically from a different first responder, from a different agency. And I think the one thing that's resonating with me is that you're right, that we really do need to do more in this country to help people out. I mean, the injury's been inflicted by your service to the community. It was not something, you weren't being reckless or anything like that. You were just doing your job, and as a result, you've now got a mental health injury. So um, I think that resonates a lot. Another thing I take away is just how bloody similar the experiences are between first responders and between and defence. I'll loop them in as well. Just that you talk to guys who've come back, and the other thing is a lot of veterans or a lot of people who are ex-defence end up becoming first responders in the community as well. It just seems to be that calling to service and whatever changes. But I'm just so happy we got you on. It's been really good. What are your thoughts, Schultzy?
Yeah, mate. Peter, I was just thinking, mate. Do you want to give a shout out for your podcast? And so we can get
Absolutely.
that
Give it
sort
a
of stuff
plug.
out. Yeah, yeah. Give it a plug, mate.
Yeah, cheers, mate. Yeah, so my podcast is called Beyond the Call, Experiences of High Trauma Occupations. And I do long format interviews or conversations with people in high trauma occupations, such as first responders, um, but also ones outside of the box that people don't think of. I've had an escort on there. I've had an NRL referee on there. Things that people don't think about, but they're still highly traumatic. The amount of abuse a referee gets, I'm
Yeah,
guilty.
probably
I've
for
done
me, Pete.
Yeah.
it. Exactly. So, so I try and, yeah, my show is it's probably a little bit more deep, and dark than yours. Yours is always a light-hearted conversation, and I've really appreciated I've listened to every episode of yours, and I really appreciate it. Some of mine go for 4 hours, but yeah, it's something that I'm just trying to get people. The aim of it was to allow people in similar environments or similar occupations to maybe just identify if they're going through something and share an experience that somebody else has had, and maybe reach out for a bit of help if they need it. So yeah, it's something I find it really therapeutic.
Mate, that's really good. I think. It's very very important to realise that you're not alone. That there are shared experiences. We've spoken about it on ours, but you go probably a little bit more into depth of actually sharing that experience that everybody has. And like there might be other NRL referees, for example, or escorts that, listen to it and go, oh, shit, like I'm not alone in this. And that was one thing that, I mean, especially I was very lucky in the police having a mate like Damo, because a lot of the times we used to share things and realize that holy shit, we're exactly the same, like the experiences and how we react to things. So you because sometimes you just think you're mentally ill.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the guests I had on is Dr. Jacqueline Drew. And the reason I bring her up is she's actually a police psychologist for the Queensland Police Service. And she's a professor at Griffith Uni. And she is really world renowned into organisational trauma. And one of the statistics that she gave, which just rings so true, because is organizational trauma is 12 times more likely to cause PTSD than occupational trauma.
Wow.
Yeah,
So
wow.
what happens to us is 12 times, the way we're treated is 12 times more likely to cause an injury than the jobs we go to. And that is so true.
I couldn't agree more, because that's the old saying: I can handle the knives coming at my front, I can't handle the knives coming at my back.
Yep.
That's the
Yep.
old saying we
And
used to.
even things like, the complaints process, which you've been through before. I've been subject to a complaints process that takes 9 months, and that
Yeah.
just hurts.
Yeah.
Yep.
I had one, and well, Damo, you were under investigation once,
Yeah.
and you had to take some stress leave, and I remember sitting there when you actually rang me up and told me that, and I thought, holy shit, like, because you sit there and you hear people taking stress leave, you're going, oh yeah, they're just taking it easy and all that, and I think it's the first time I realised that how stressful sometimes those situations are.
Yeah.
Um, my best mate was going through this, and like it was a big wake up call for me. Sitting there just going, holy shit, that's like this is it's more serious than what anybody thinks it is.
That was
Every time it
yeah.
happens, it's a chink in the armor.
It is. It was
Yeah,
2 weeks. I took 2 weeks. Oh no, it wasn't even that. I think I was off for a week, and as soon as I got a resolution, I was fine. I was back to work, happy as. But
yeah,
the cloak of darkness over me, not knowing what the outcome was going to be, was that was the trouble. And it didn't matter. I could go to a violent domestic and not care about the domestic. I'd be thinking about my investigation,
Yep.
and
And
that's
part of the code of conduct is you're not allowed to discuss when you're the subject of a complaint. You're not allowed to discuss
exactly.
it with anyone.
yeah,
So you've got this cloud over you that you can't share with anyone who you work with.
Yeah, no,
yeah,
exactly right. Well, Pete, no, thanks very much, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been great to get a bit more in depth and to speak. Look, you've got our support.
yep,
We wish you all the best with your ongoing struggles, and you've got friends in us. So we thank you very much for coming on with the 200 Cops, and we might even, I don't know, we might even request an invitation to join yours. Be on the call.
yeah,
That sounds good. No, I've really enjoyed talking to you guys. Like I said, I've listened to all your shows, and I love the banter you have between yourselves. But so much that you guys talk about, even though it's a different agency, is so there's so much similarity in the emotion and the feeling behind things. So, while the experience might be slightly different, the effects are often very, very similar.
No, we appreciate it, mate. I couldn't agree more.
yeah. Thanks for reaching out, Pete, and yeah, like so a lot of the stuff, especially a lot of that stuff I see on your Facebook and stuff you sent through is I think it was the American cop, sitting there talking about how you get shot in the line of duty or get injured in the line of duty, and everybody's around you and caring, and you basically get a tunnel where people are clapping and giving you everything, and then suddenly somebody goes away on mental health leave and everybody's quiet like it's crickets, and that's
Absolutely.
it that one really hit me because I'm going, you know what, that's dead right. We should be looking after those that have been struck in the job, by PTSD or depression and all that sort of stuff. We need to keep an eye on that a lot closer than what we do.
Yeah. I just want to talk, sorry to extend a little bit. There's a gentleman called Peter Solomon, and he unfortunately passed away in January. Peter Solomon was the officer in charge of Texas Ambulance Station, and he was awarded the Ambulance Service Medal, which, for those that don't know, is pretty much the highest honour we get as paramedics. The equivalent would be the Australian Police Medal for police, and it's a federally awarded medal that gets given by the Governor General in a ceremony, and he was awarded that, and then a couple of months after that, developed some pretty severe PTSD, and he got to the stage where he was denied a disability support pension. He was given he given basically no money from work cover. You have to sue work cover and prove negligence to get anything more than the amount. So a legislated amount for work coverage, you get about $3,800 per percent, and you will very rarely see a mental health injury more than 15. So maybe you get $40,000, but that's got to pay for that's your income for the rest of your life from that job, and you got to pay for your own medical expenses. I spend $250 a month in meds at least.
Yeah.
Two psychology sessions at what's that, $200 a session, and then a psychiatrist, every 6 weeks or so at $500 a pop. So it doesn't last long. He was given no certificate of appreciation when he was medically retired. He was given no fanfare. He was given no support, and there was bugger all QAS presence at his funeral. I saw 2 people from the QAS. That if he died in the line of duty, or if he had a heart attack at home, it would have been no dramas whatsoever. But he was hurt after receiving our highest honour and was given bugger all. He was forgotten about, wiped from memory. And that's where we are really bad. And we've got to get better at supporting our people.
Yeah, it's got to change.
Yeah, definitely. Alrighty, mate. Well, Damo, Peter, is there anything else you want to add, mate? Like I said, mate, we can go as long as you want.
No, I think there's always more stories to tell. So obviously this one's been a bit all over the shop, but mainly on the PTSD and that experience. But there's always stories to share, and especially police and ambulance doing jobs. So we'll do it again in the future.
Definitely.
Yep. Thanks very much, Pete.
All right.
Thanks for having me on. It's been great, guys.
Well, Schultzy, that's it. The Two Ordinary Cops for another week, mate.
It is, mate. Yep, this is us signing off. And, well, for all those listeners that actually like a longer episode, you're going to enjoy this one. And the amount of information and just a different view, which aligns with ours, but just from a different perspective, is really important from Peter. So, Peter, thank you very much again for coming on. And, hope you all enjoyed it.
And we'll Pete, sorry, Schultzy, just to finish off, have you tracked down our elusive mate in the Northern Territory yet?
No, I haven't, mate. We might have to get the paramedics, the fireys, and the police to actually track him down. But don't you worry, mate. We got to get a hold of Dave Musgrave.
We're more likely to interview a family of Tasmanian tigers than 5
You'd have to wake the fireys up, wouldn't you?
Oh, that old chestnut.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
Oh, hey, well, Peter, you know why there are police.
Why is that?
So forests can have heroes.
Yeah, I've often said that one. Yeah, paramedics exist, so fireys can have heroes.
Yeah.
Oh, God, love it. I do miss the banter. I do miss it. Yeah. On that fine note, gents, it's been a pleasure.
It has. All right.
Thanks,
we'll see you all next week.